This unit is, or this presentation is going to be about slavery in America from 1609 to 1865. The origins of slavery go back since the beginning of human history. Slavery has existed all over the world. People were enslaved for a number of different reasons. They were captured in battle, they owed a debt, or they were born to slave parents. The word slave comes from the Slavic people of Eastern Europe who were conquered so often that their name became synonymous with servitude. Most cultures have practiced slavery in one form or another. However, the United States is unique in that no other country has had slavery of one group of people for as long and as completely as the United States enslaved African people. This was a section of an Atlantic slave trade. The Middle Passage was a section of the Atlantic slave trade that transported African people from Africa to slave markets in the Americas. It was called the Middle Passage because it was the second of the three-part triangular trade route. Slaves were packed very tightly on ships, shackled, and fed very little, if anything, for a 3 to 5 month journey. They had to lay there. Some of you have seen the miniseries Roots. It shows the slave ships. If people died on the ships, the bodies were just thrown overboard. About 18 million Africans were transported between 1600 and 1800, and about 3 million of those died on the journey itself. This is the triangular trade route. You can see the Middle Passage here goes from the northwestern coast of Africa to the Americas. Some were dropped off in South America for the Spanish, and then some in the West Indies, and then some up in the plantation states, which tells you why in South America you have such a diversity, and in the Caribbean of racial differences. You have some people in Brazil who are very, very African. They have African roots, and so they may look different from other Brazilians. Then you have the third route, which is taking tobacco and cotton and sugar to Europe, and then manufactured goods down to the coast. Europeans originally enslaved American Indians, but many of them died from diseases that the Europeans had brought over. They also lived in that area, and so they knew how to run away. They were able to have family come and find them, and they knew the lay of the land. Europeans began importing African slaves who were resistant to European diseases. First African slaves arrived in Jamestown, Virginia on a Portuguese ship in 1609. Shortly before their arrival, slaves were fed better to make them look healthy. So they once they got off the ships, they were usually in horrible conditions. Sometimes they had sores all over them, and you can see from this great sale of slaves here in 1855, referred to as bucks for the males and wenches for the female. Slaves were auctioned off by plantation owners and businessmen from the city. And they performed a variety of jobs. Slave codes were laws put in place to control slaves. These codes forbid slaves from learning how to read, owning firearms, or marrying a white person. The penalty for learning to read was to have his or her thumb cut off. These laws also made children born into slaves for life, and that is called generational slavery. You can see from the picture here that slaves wore slave tags. That should be slave. Whoops. What am I looking at? You've got a slave collar. Was equipped with bells. So if the slave tried to run away, there's a yoke that was used to bind two slaves together, and this man's back has been whipped with iron barbs. This picture down here shows a slave that was captured after he tried to run away. A lot of people say that slaves did not resist, but they were bound to a life of servitude, and slaves resisted in a number of ways. They escaped, they slowed down on the job, they intentionally did a job wrong, or participated in a violent rebellion. One of the most famous slave revolts was in Virginia. Nat Turner led 70 other slaves to kill 55 white men, women, and children. Turner and his men were later captured and hanged. One thing that is very interesting is when there were violent slave revolts, the slaves very, very rarely killed their own master. They may have had someone else do it, but it was kind of a paternalistic relationship that I will explain to you later. Slaves also resisted by singing Negro spirituals or religious folk songs, and those oftentimes contained coded messages. It's important to note that these Negro spirituals led to the creation of jazz and blues in the United States. You've got the tale of Nat Turner there, and then there is a reward for runaway slaves. A lot of them were named Tom. There's a very important book by Harriet Beecher Stowe called Uncle Tom's Cabin that talked about a slave named Tom, and he became a very, very sympathetic character and made people really think his master was Simon Legree, who was the epitome of a horrible, horrible master, and so for the first time, slaves became more of a sympathetic group of people. You have the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman, we know about that. This is not a railroad. I taught a whole unit and somebody said, well, do they still have the tracks for the Underground Railroad? It was referred to that. It was not actually an underground railroad. They referred to places as stations. And they were marked, as you can see here, with lawn jockeys, a lot of those, and what they were is they were safe houses, places that slaves could go. They could hide in the barn, they could hide in root cellars, places like that. Also quilts showing the track pattern that told people that that was a safe place. They would have quilts hanging up on the clothesline, so that people would know that they could stop there and it was a safe place. These are routes that people took. Most of the time, they had to go all the way up to Canada because of the fugitive slave laws. The fugitive slave law said that any slave that was captured in the North had to be returned to the South. Sometimes people did it, sometimes people did not. Fugitive, of course, is somebody who is running away from the law. So you can also see here that some people took boats and came up towards the north. Whoops, sorry. And they'd go through the Appalachian Mountains up into Canada. Um, and Canada was really the only place that was completely safe. Or you get up here into the North Country and nobody wants to chase them up there, chase people up there. You go down here to Florida, and people would escape through the to the Caribbean islands and through Texas, going down through to Mexico. The abolition of slavery. Here you've got these are the stations. Some of the stations here. You've got the Peter Mott House. Right here, you've got Holden House in New Jersey. These are places that you can still go and visit. Wheatley's, Burlington, Croft Farm, Cherry Hill. It's interesting because there was not. This is not like Nazi Germany where people were penalized for helping slaves. Again, you could be fined for housing a slave and a fugitive slave in your house. In fact, I think there's a movie out now that talks about a freed slave in the North who was captured and then enslaved again. I can't remember what the name of it is. But you can go and visit these places. These are historic landmarks. The abolition of slavery from 1861 to 1865, Americans in the North and South fought the Civil War. Slavery was certainly an issue, but it was more over politics and economics. Slavery was not a an economically sound way to do business because what the plantation owners and farmers would do in the South is overplant their farms. They would make the soil acidic, and so you couldn't use they basically burn out the soil. Um, they if slaves were ill, they still had to feed them and clothe them. And slavery, it was not just about the work; it was about a sign of wealth. In fact, the better kept the slaves were, the more respected people were and thought of as being very, very wealthy. Because if their slaves were dressed nice and had good food and were not starving to death, you knew that person had a lot of money. More than 600,000 soldiers on both sides died. More Americans died in the Civil War than in all other wars put together, and that's because it was both sides were Americans. In January of 1863, President Lincoln made it clear that he sought to end slavery when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. After the war, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution ended slavery in the United States, and slavery had been abolished in New Jersey since 1804, but the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. It obviously in 1863, and if anyone says to you that Well, actually, I'm just going to ask the question. Do you think that slavery in the United States or has anything to do with the racism that we have in the United States? Or do you not believe that we have racism in the United States? And with that, we will end this time together and have a discussion. Thank you.